I'm Terrah Stacy, Treasurer CFO of Springboro Schools, and today we are going to talk about how Ohio school districts are funded. Springboro Schools have two main sources of funding: local property taxes and other local revenue, which equates to about 69% of our total funding, and the other main source is state funding, of which nearly 24% comes from the state funding formula, and nearly 8% is due to property tax rollbacks that are given as a credit to homeowners and reimbursed to the schools by the state. Today, we are going to focus on state funding since we are in the middle of biennium budget discussions that will determine how K-12 public schools across Ohio are funded for the next 2 years. In 1997's Duroff decision, it was ruled that Ohio was in violation of Article 6, Section 2 of the Ohio Constitution, and the lack of funding of Ohio public school districts was deemed unconstitutional. At the time of the decision, schools on average were being funded 43% from the state. However, Springboro Schools was only being funded at 32% at the time of that decision. 28 years later, we are fighting to maintain our funding at 24% with guarantees. 2021, the Fair School Funding Plan was implemented as the funding model to fund Ohio's 607 school districts. This plan was created by practitioners and experts who spent countless hours determining what it actually costs to educate a typical child in each Ohio school district today. The Fair School Funding Plan establishes the base cost to educate a typical child. It then determines the state and local share of that base cost. The local share is determined by each community's property values and taxpayer income. Once the local share is determined, the remaining is the state share. Since not all children are typical, there is additional aid called categorical aid that provides additional funding for our most vulnerable students, such as special education, English language learners, and economically disadvantaged. The additional funding follows the same state-local share as base cost. In 2021, the Fair School Funding Plan was implemented as a 6-year plan that would be phased in over 3 bienniums, in which both sides of the funding formula, the base cost side and the taxpayer income and property value side, would need to be regularly updated in order to keep the formula balanced, predictable, and equitable. In addition, when the Fair School Funding Plan was implemented, a guarantee was put into place to ensure no school district would receive less state support due to the Fair School Funding Plan. Springboro Schools was receiving 33% funding at the time the Fair School Funding Plan was implemented, which is now at 24% with the 2020 guarantee in place. If the guarantee was removed, even with base cost increases, we would fall to the state share minimum of 10% funding, shifting 90% of the cost to educate a typical child who are taxpayers. It is crucial to our community that the following continue. Update base cost to reflect 2024 cost. By not updating base costs, but updating taxpayer income and increased property values, more and more of our costs will be shifted to local property owners and erode the funding formula, putting us back in an endless cycle of implementing funding formulas that are not equitable, predictable, or sustainable. It's important to implement the final 2-year phase-in of the Fair School Funding Plan, including, as mentioned before, an update to base cost inputs at 2024 levels, continue funding guarantees at 100%, and increase categorical funding for our most vulnerable to 50%. It is time the state works towards a partnership to properly fund the education of 90% of Ohio's children, instead of continually shifting more of the costs to our local taxpayers. Property tax reform would not be needed if there wasn't such a reliance on taxpayers to pick up the lion's share of the cost due to the state not picking up their fair share of the partnership to educate Ohio children.